Welcome to Precision Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 38 of ASP.NET Grid View tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss about using object data source control with details view. In my SQL Server database, I have this table TBL employee, which has got ID, first name, last name, city, gender, etc. Now I want to display this data within a grid view control, but then I don't want to be showing all the columns. Instead, I just want to display ID, first name, and city columns. But then once I select an employee within the grid view control, then for that selected employee, I want to show all of the columns within the details view control. We discussed about doing exactly the same thing in part 37, but using a SQL data source control. In this video, we'll discuss about using object data source control. Just like a grid view control, details view is also a data bound control. In general, details view is usually used to display one row at a time. Now, since we want to use object data source controls in this demo, we need to build the employee data access layer. So let's go ahead and add employee data access layer class file for this project. And I'm going to name this as employee data access layer.cs. And now the important thing to keep in mind here is that look at the grid view control. It needs only three properties, ID, first name, and city of the employee object. But whereas the details view requires those three, ID, first name, and city, plus the rest of the properties. Now I'm going to define two classes here to hold employee information. Okay, the first class is going to be employee basic class, and this employee basic class is going to contain just three properties: ID, first name, and city properties. Okay, which is what is the data required by the grid view control. Okay, and just to speed things up, I have that class already typed, so let me copy that and paste within our employee data access layer. So if you look at this class, it's employee basic, and it has got three properties: ID, first name, and city, all of them auto implemented properties. Okay, and then I'm going to define an employee class, public class employee, and this class is going to inherit from employee basic. And the reason why I would do that is because our details view control requires ID, first name, and city plus the rest of the properties as well. So instead of, if I don't make my employee class inherit from employee basic class, then I'll have to define each and every property again within the employee class. But instead of that, just to reuse some of the code, I am actually inheriting, making this class employee inherit from employee basic. That way, I get to define only the properties that are required in addition to these three properties. And again, just to speed things up, I have that class already typed. So let me copy and paste that within our employee data access layer. So if you look at this, the rest of the properties are here: last name, gender, date of birth, etc. Okay, so we are done defining the classes. Now obviously, now we have to write some ADO.NET code. So the first thing to do is to import those ADO.NET namespaces: system.data, system.data.sql client, and system.configuration. Okay, so within our employee data access layer class, first I need a method which is going to return list of employee basic objects which contain properties ID, first name, and city. But I want all the employees. Okay, and just to speed things up, I have that method already typed as well. So let me copy and paste that within our employee data access layer. Okay, so if you look at this method, get all employees basic details. Basic details are ID, first name, and city properties. Okay, so to look at this method, it is actually returning a list of employee basic objects. Okay, obviously we are creating a list of employee basic object because that's what we want to return back. And then this is regular ADO.NET code. So here we are using the configuration manager class to read the connection string from web.config file. Using that connection string, we are creating a SQL connection object, and then we are preparing our SQL command. Look at the SQL command: select ID, first name, and city columns. So we are only selecting these three columns from TBL employee table. And then we are opening the connection, executing the command, and then we are looping through each row that is retrieved from the database, converting the row into an employee object. Look at this, the column values are now being stored into the properties of this employee basic object, which is then added to this list. And finally we return the list. Okay, so that is get all employee basic details method. Now in addition to that, so this method is going to supply data for our grid view control. But then once I select an employee's record within the grid view control, for the selected employee, we need to return all of the rows. I'm sorry, all of the columns. Okay, so obviously now we need a method which is going to retrieve all of these columns for the given employee. So get employee details by ID. We want employees full details, meaning all of the columns. Okay, so now I have this method here. Let me copy it and paste it within our employee data access layer. So if you look at this method, look at the method name, get employee full details by ID. So we are passing in an employee ID, the selected employee ID, and for that employee we want to get his full details. So here look at the return type. We are not returning a list of employees, because what do we need in the details view? Just one employee object, but all of the columns of that employee. Okay, so we have just one employee object here, and again this is straightforward ADO.NET code. Use the configuration manager class, read the connection string, create the SQL connection object, and look at your SQL command. Select star from TBL employee where ID is equal to @ID. So we're using a parameterized query. We are using a where clause here, and we are filtering based on the ID. Again, we are using a SQL parameter here, for which we'll have to supply a value, and that's why we are creating a SQL parameter object here. The parameter name is @ID, and the value for that is coming into this method as another parameter. Okay, and then finally add that parameter object to the parameters collection of the command object, and then open the connection, execute the command, and loop through each row. And look at what we are doing here. We are converting the column values into the properties of that object. And then once we are done with that, finally we are actually returning that employee object back. Okay, let's change this zoom percentage to 100. So we are finally returning that employee object back. So we have the two required methods. The first method is going to return the data for grid view control. The second method will return the data for details view control. Okay, at this point let's go ahead and build our solution so that the employee data access layer class is compiled. Okay, so within our web form we need a grid view control and a details view control. So let's go to the web form, drag and drop a grid view control. Let's auto format that. We want brown sugar scheme, and then we need a details view control. Obviously we want to use let's auto format this as well. Let's choose brown sugar scheme. Now we want to use object data source controls, so let's drag and drop two object data source controls. Okay, so first let's configure object data source 1 control. Now our data access layer is going to be demo.employee data access layer, and then this has got a method get all employee basic details, which is going to return a list of employee basic objects. List of the employee basic object has got ID, first name, and city columns. So click finish. Now let's associate our object data source 1 with our grid view control. Okay, and then we also want to enable selection, so the select button is shown here. Okay, and the next thing is we want to configure object data source 2 control. So configure data source, choose your business object, employee data access layer, click next. Let's choose our select method. The select method this time is going to be get all employee full detail, get employee full details by ID. Okay, and then we want to pass basically the ID of the selected employee. Okay, look at this. This method has got a parameter. So now I click next. Obviously we'll have to supply a value for that parameter. Where is that value going to come from? From grid view control. Okay, so from another control on this web form. So what's your parameter source? It's going to be a control, and which control is that? Grid view 1, and grid view 1 dot selected value. So that's the property. So this ID is going to get its value from grid view 1 dot selected value property. So click finish, and let's associate this object data source 2 with our details view control. Okay, look at that. We got basically all of the columns there. So let's run this now. And as you expect, when the web form loads, the data should be displayed within the grid view control. but then we might get an error. So look at this, we have an error here. Data keys must be specified on grid view 1 before the selected data keys can be retrieved. So if you remember, when we were configuring this object data source to control, we said, the parameter ID which this method expects, get all employees full details by ID, for this parameter the value is coming from the selected value property of grid view 1 control. But for us to use the selected value property, we need to set the data key names for grid view 1 control. Okay, so let's flip this to the source mode, and then within grid view 1 control, all we need to do is set data key names property, and that should be equal to ID, the employee ID column. Okay, so with that change, let me go ahead and run this now. And when the web form loads, it should render the grid view control. But then there is a problem here. There's no row selected within the grid view control, but then look at the details view. It's showing some blank data there. So when the web form initially renders, when there is no row selected within the grid view control, we don't want this details view to be visible. So what I'm going to do here, and we don't want to do that within the page load event. We discussed about this in part 37. We want to do it in pre-render event. So I'm going to copy this event handler, and I'm going to change the event name to pre-render. And here I'm going to check if gridview1 dot selected row. If that is equal to null, then what we want to do, we want to hide details view. So I'm going to say details view dot visible is equal to false. On the other hand, if there is a selected row within grid view 1 control, then we want to turn on the visibility of details view 1 control. So that's it. Okay, now let's run this, and as you might expect, when the web form initially loads, when there is no row selected, the details view will not be visible. So now I select the employees row. Look at that, the selected employee is shown. But there's one problem here. Look at this ID, first name and city columns, they are displayed in the end. Instead I want them at the beginning. What do I do to correct this problem? The simplest way to solve this problem is within your details view control. Obviously for each row that is displayed here, you have a field here. Okay, so just change those fields. So I want ID, first name and city columns, rows on the top. So I'm just going to cut them and then paste them on the top within the fields collection of this details view control. So now I run this, as you might expect, ID, first name and city columns will be displayed on the top. So ID, first name and city, and then last name, gender, date of birth, etc. Okay. On this slide you can find resources for ASP.NET, C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.